Welcome back, everybody. This is not a Malazan video. Nope, this is me talking about a book that I've read a while ago. Actually, like, I don't know, 2-3 weeks ago I finished it finally. It was a buddy read with Ola, the Reading Witch, so expect some more content. Oh, I hate that word. Expect something more about it later in the week or whenever we'll be done. We have like a collab or chat about it or something. But what I'm talking about is Waking the Moon by Elizabeth Hand, and I'm going to talk about it, ramble about it in a while, and try to explain why y'all should go and read it. And as usual with such books, I'm gonna go and split it into like a discussion of themes and stuff that you can go and read, like even if you haven't read it yet. So it's gonna be spoilerish free, and then I'll go into spoilers later on if I feel that I have to. So yeah, this is my second video about a book by Elizabeth Hand, and I'm once again like very impressed by the book. And it's an older one, it's from 1995, I think, and yeah, it's something we'll be talking about now. So let's do this. Cheers. So, first off, this is a book about all the things that I like that are very much my theme. That is rock and roll, drug abuse, feminism, mythology, and the occult. So yeah, of course I had to read that. And it is exactly that kind of thing. It kind of falls in, can be seen as something of a college novel in a way, but only part of it. It has an odd structure, and yeah, it. Those are all things that we're going to talk about in a moment. But basically, the really short synopsis is that our first person narrator goes to a college of St. John the Divine and the Archangels in Washington City in the 70s and crosses paths with maybe supernatural things. And yeah, then things happen. I mean, I guess like the actual back cover goes into more details, but I feel like mentioning those things may actually spoil more, so that's not what we're going to do here. We're going to go into those aspects later on when it gets spoilerish. But let's look at what we have. We have a novel in three parts, one taking place in the 70s, one summing up parts like the in a short way what happens between the events in that first part and the events in the third part, which takes place in 1994. So, and that middle part is rather short. It's sort of like a just connecting those two parts, those two larger parts that are the main meat of the story. It is partly told through a first person narrative by someone called Catherine Sweeney Cassidy, who studies anthropology and later on works as an anthropologist in a museum. And partly it's a third person narrative when we have to look at stuff that happens outside of Sweeney's personal experience but is necessary for the story, which is a weird thing to read. Like, I mean, that was one of the things that I found, like, I don't want to say problematic because that's not what I mean. It's something that I found odd, or at the beginning at least, a bit jarring to switch within one chapter sometimes between a first person narrative and a third person narrative. It's just kind of odd. It's an odd choice, I feel. But it works really well in telling a really fascinating story. It is, as most of the things that I read, at least in part, supernatural. It is far more open with the supernatural and magical part than fantasy part than Elizabeth Hand's other novel that I've spoken about here, that being Wilding Hall, where the supernatural aspect could just be imaginary. Here with Waking the Moon, it's pretty clear that that's not the case. What else? We have all the strengths that Elizabeth Hand also showed in Wilding Hall. So we see that is something that she was always good at, that being giving an incredible sense of place and time. Um, you know, that's something that I find fascinating with historical novels, and oftentimes it doesn't really work with hand. I feel like when she talks about the 70s, and it's those small details when you have like a situation where it's mentioned that someone sold a guitar just like the one from that guy from the 13th floor elevators, and I'm like, fuck yeah, I know what that is. I know exactly which guitar of Roky Erickson she's talking about. But it's a small detail, or like all these other things, like people wearing MC5 t-shirts, so that whole like proto-punk, proto-heavy rock, whatever stuff is very much in there. Also, just the lushness of the prose that I appreciate so much, because it's like these are teenagers that just go to college for the first time in a time and place where social norms that were obviously in general stricter in the 70s than they are now in a lot of ways are still extremely loose. People are smoking weed all the time. Their approach to sexuality is much more open in a way at that point than it may be nowadays, or at least in parts of social media. So there's that. And they're like romantics, all of them. They're crazy. I mean, they have to be romantic because they study anthropology, and you don't do that if you actually have a like plan to have a career, I guess. And you have that over like that over how does I don't even know how to say that over emotional lush prose that fits exactly that style. You know, the kind of thing like the prose you write as a teenager, or the poems you write as a teenager, that are way too saturated with emotions because you're way more emotional at that point. And that comes through together with that liberty, or that I like that feeling of liberty and liberation that you get when you come to like a new place for the first time. You start your studies, you plan to take them seriously, but you end up boozing and partying the entire first semester, which is what a lot of people do, and rightly so, or a lot of people did before like the whole education system was like taken over completely by capitalism, as it has been in like Europe with like the whole Bologna reforms and everything. So we have that feeling in there, and I so love that. It's like everything from like the description of the clothes, the feelings. It's just so. I mean, authentic is something that I can't really judge because I haven't been there. I'm not that old. I know, hard to believe, but you know, it is. It feels authentic. So it's like, to use that word, verisimilitude. Verisimilitude is really, you know, strong. There's like you can feel, you can basically smell the weed while reading it, which is great in that first part. The second part hit me even harder in a way because, and yeah, our main character is now stuck in her career and is in that odd place that some people have. You know, not saying I am not one of them, because I kind of am sometimes. Like, you do something and you're a bit aimless in the pursuit of your like career or whatnot, and then suddenly you're stuck somewhere and realize that like you haven't really done anything the last 10 years. You haven't really lived the last 10 years. You've just like been going on in a way. And that odd feeling of aimlessness, while all around you, all the people you knew have suddenly gotten, you know, careers and families and whatnot. And you're like, what did I actually do in that time? That feeling pervades a lot of like the second part. And then that idea that maybe you get another chance, or a second chance to actually get it right this time around, which happens to our main protagonist there. But also the feeling of like the 90s, which once again I was too young to have been. I'm too young to have been there in that way. That feeling of like the 70s are gone. Kids today with MTV, they don't understand how the rebellion of the punk era. They don't get that stuff. The beginning of like the computer age, all of that stuff is once again captured in a magnificent way. The whole like yeah, the beginning of irony. Like the '90s are like already like an ironic decade, I guess. The beginning of like looking at everything ironically and with that distance because you're starting to be jaded by, growing older and shit. Once again, that mood is transported in a fantastic way, which, yeah, I just really appreciate it. Once again, it's a these are topics like the novel in general is not exactly my usual like staple of epic fantasy or slightly more philosophical fantasy or whatever else I read. Or but it's it feels off the beaten track, but I feel it also is off the beaten track for what you might call urban fantasy, which it kind of is. Because while we have a lot of those ideas, we have supernatural stuff, we have young protagonists. Our main protagonist is actually female, falls in love with someone that may or may not be more than just a regular person. You have all these ideas in there. But once again, we're talking about like 1994, so this is before the big boom of like supernatural romance and shit. And this is not a romance. I mean, it is a romance, but not in that way. It also deals with a lot of topics that at least I haven't seen a lot show up in fantasy or urban fantasy in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously, there is a lot of discussion of feminism in there and the conflicts within like different waves of feminism on the side. There's also a transgender character in there at some point, in a way, and the discussion of homosexuality in general, and in with some of the other characters in there is also something that I haven't seen a lot in 90s fiction or 90s fantastical fiction or supernatural fiction because we didn't talk about that stuff at the time, I feel. Some of course those are themes like fluid gender identities are something that you carry over from the 70s that were like a thing in that like 70s 60s 70s counterculture and stuff like that. We just kind of forgot about it until like the last 5 or 6 years, I feel, and in overall culture. I mean, obviously not people that are have been involved with these aspects of life and with gender studies or whatever. Those people have always thought about it or lived those experiences. Of course, that's true. But like in general mainstream culture, there's like this black hole between like the 60s and 70s on the one hand and then like the 2000s or 2010s even in a lot of ways. And yeah, Waking the Moon kind of fills that hole or just goes against that trend by making these things in a very casual way part of the story. It's not about that. It's just that characters with off the norm gender identities play a role in the story. And in those situations, their gender identities also play a part in the story, but it's not, that's not what the story in general is about. Another thing that I really appreciated is Elizabeth Hand gets her anthropology right. There are scenes with anthropological like content, and with archaeological like stuff. There's archaeologists and anthropologists in that book, and whenever she describes part of being an anthropologist or an archaeologist, the daily life of most people actually take that for a career. She gets it very, very right. So, I mean, I didn't check up her biography, so I don't know if she actually studied that as well. It wouldn't surprise me. It feels like she has more or less first-hand knowledge or maybe knows people in that field. It just, the way she does it feels really great. The references she puts in when she references like Fraser or Robert Graves, because that's obviously the direction this is going, they also check out. They're great. And I'm always in there when someone quotes Robert Graves, because The White Goddess, even though I don't believe in anything that's everything that's in that book, is a fantastic book that like everyone should read at least once, because it makes you think, and that's like the point there. So yeah, getting that part right is also amazing. Another thing that I really found fascinating in the book is how quickly, in weird ways, she switches between like very everyday everyday 70s psychedelic time, but still that and actual supernatural happenings. Like there's a few violent scenes in there, and when they happen without like any kind of warning. You just like get dropped in there, and like the way the supernatural sometimes takes over the story is impressive, I would say. So there's that as well. Now, did I have like negative feelings or never negative or not negative, like criticism? Of course, I do have a few. One of them is that, and we're gonna in the slightly spoilerish, by which I mean it is mentioned on the cover blurb, on the back cover. It is mentioned that she encounters the Benandanti, and her depiction of the Benandanti just felt a bit off. Maybe it's because I just recently reread the Night Battles. I did a video about it, but the point is, I just recently looked very deep, much into the Benandanti, and her use of it is like it could just have been any other magical society or people or a secret society. It just felt like she just didn't want to use Freemasons or Illuminati at this point, which I guess makes sense. But I feel like she could have done more with it, is what I'm trying to say here. So that's sort of a slight criticism. The other thing, obviously, is, as I said before, that odd mixture of like third person and first person narrative felt a bit odd or jarring at the beginning, but I got used to it later on. So I'm overall fine with it. I'm just mentioning it as something that may or may not take some time, some getting used to, I guess. But yeah, those are like more or less the criticisms. Now let's go into more spoilerish content here, and I'm not going to go into like spoiler like plot points yet, but if you are really really sensitive, this is probably the point where you should click off. All right, let's talk about the metaplot, or what you may call the big themes. Goddess worship, matriarchal societies, the whole 9 yards. So, if you take what you may see in the main theses of Robert Graves' The White Goddess, if you take that idea that there was once a matriarchal society, a goddess worship, a cult worshipping some, you can call her white goddess, maybe three-faced goddess of mother, maiden, crone, where the crone is obviously also the destroyer. If you have that, if you take that idea that there was once this uniform religion or goddess worship all over Europe, at least Europe and beyond, like into Siberia, into the Middle East, if you believe that that was the case and was then taken over by a patriarchal society with what we now call, like, as like the classic mythologies, the Greco-Roman mythologies and stuff like that. If you take that as an idea, and I am skeptical if that was actually the case, but I certainly find it an intriguing idea. If you take that as like your background of your world, and then figure out about, well, what might happen if we are trying to use that as an argument, or like if we're trying to bring back that worship and of that goddess and use it as a tool to help emancipate women all over the world. So we combine that, or like we do that thing that is like super important, that is mixing religion with politics, because that's what it's always is. Because the idea of secularism, in large part, is obviously just an idea and hard to pull through. So if we combine those two things, and also believe that obviously that goddess is actually does actually exist, then we get like a supernatural plot about maybe over like large like centuries, creating or like chosen people who can reenact those old rites to then awaken that goddess to then liberate all still suppressed women of the world. And that's sort of like the meta plot there. And I like it because, yeah, it has been there all the time. It just needed someone to actually go and write a book about it. That kind of metaplot writes itself, and to set it in, and this is like the genius there, to set it in the 70s, between the 70s and 90s, between like the overall like rediscovery of like things like Robert Graves' White Goddess in like the crazy times that are like 60s and 70s counterculture, and then combine it with that second wave, or is it second wave, but that new wave of feminism, like the more geared towards your successful women because that have like careers and stuff in the beginning of the 90s, and see how those two like eras of feminism already, you know, are in conflict with each other. That's just pure genius, and to actually write it in 95 when that is very much the case just works extremely well for me. I'm just like, it's a way to discuss those matters that I feel may make them accessible to people who have never really thought about how such things evolve, and how debates in feminism within feminism actually evolve. It may just make that way more accessible, and I really appreciate it. Also, the idea that such things as like mystical or mythical, not mystical experiences are an important part of it, right? Of like ourselves still today, like spirituality, the whole birth of the New Age movement. Those things play all into that because there is that strong component, like there is that strong part of a more feminist New Age part of that. Once again, in which stuff like Robert Graves plays a huge role. So mixing all of that into something that is at its like bare bone minimum a novel about college kids getting caught up in something really weird. Yeah, that's pretty much genius. And that's basically what she does. Now let's look at another thing that I found very well done. Interpersonal relationships in there, they are like in the first one they are extremely immature teenagers on drugs all over the place, which makes sense because those people are 17 and 18. They've just started going to college. They're like on on acid, weed, and strange hormones all the time. um, to expect them to have like rationally grounded relationships just doesn't work. And that sense of like actually falling in love in that like crazy way is it's just done really well in that first part. And then we come to the second part. We have people that are trying to figure out like that have sort of made like their peace with their existence in a lot of ways. That being like one of my favorite characters in the story, Annie Harmon, having, you know, her angry gay like like gay singer songwriter musician career, and like a work ongoing long term relationship with another woman. That is great. Then you have like Angelica being that working mom in a way. Well, not working mom, you know, she's anything but that strong single person that just takes whatever she wants, which, you know, makes a lot of sense because they, yeah, makes a lot of sense because that's kind of the role that she's also in, that has in that mythical thing with her getting closer to becoming like a new moon goddess. So there's there's that. But you know, you have all these people. You have someone like Sweeney who's just basically given up on romance and relationships and everything at that point. That also feels real and realistic because once again, um, relationships, romance, love, all of that is different when you're 16 or 17 from when you're 30 or 35 or whatever they are at that point. Someone like 35, 37, something like that. And she captures that as well. Elizabeth Hand captures that as well in a really realistic or real feeling way, which, you know, really cool. All right, what more to talk about here? Um, I feel like the idea of having that like Neolithic or maybe Bronze Age religion coming back, somehow specific artifacts taking over the personality of people in a way to actually further their like the motives of that lunar goddess is, well, it's a really cool idea because it is handled in a way that doesn't really ever call it magical items. It leaves a lot of that like open for a long time until like really crazy shit happens and bulls get caught, get killed, and all of that. And I like that. Then later on, when things become clearly magical, that being in the third part, obviously the first part, there's, I mean, we know there's like weird magic things happening with the Ben and Dante, but we don't know anything else about it. So yeah, that later on, it feels more as a shock, and you realize how, because the magic also is kind of strange, but by focusing very much on like the strangeness of some of like really old Cretan or whatever mythology and like paintings and murals and all those like depictions of weird stuff that we have, and to make that like magic also feel strange and weird and not just like throwing fireballs or what have you is something that I really appreciated about it. It is unique in that compared to a lot of like other like urban fantasy or fantasy in general, in that it goes to like these like parts that are uncomfortable, that are weird, can feel really, yeah, strange, and are often like very often charged with a lot of like sexual imagery and everything, which, you know, makes a ton of sense. So I appreciate Elizabeth Hand not shying away from that and going all in. So yeah, that's all things that I really appreciated about it. Now, why would I say you should read this book? First of all, because it's written extremely well. Second of all, it deals with a lot of stuff that you don't see in a lot of current urban fantasy or, you know, fantasy like that in general, in a rather explicit way. Third, it really, you know, depicts the times it takes place in, that being the 70s and the 90s, in a fascinating way for people who weren't alive at the time, weren't like old enough to experience these times, and that's great. Yeah, that's a great story, and it's a great jumping off point if you want to get into the whole like goddess cult, Robert Graves, James Fraser place as well, which I highly recommend because it's a ton of fun. So, in summary, it's a book like no other that I've read so far. It has all the strengths I have known from Elizabeth Hand's other novel that I read, that being Wilding Hall, which you also should go and read, while being in a lot of ways more in your face, more direct, more raw in a way, and it made me think a lot, and that's something that I really appreciate. So, do yourself a favor. Go check out that book. No one talks about it. More people should talk about it. It's great. It's fun, and it's odd, and it's way out there. So, go do that. And I'll talk to you later about Fall of Light. Until then, cheers.